This is Capitalize Your Finances, the show representing you, a select group of excited, ready, and fired up listeners seeking to potentially maximize your money moves and get after it. We don't settle for generic advice of always and nevers. Our currency is our intellect, and we constantly seek the logical way of likely creating advantages to potentially maximize wealth for our personal and unique situations. The show brings you this step-by-step framework to capitalize your finances in the aspects of your financial situation, and we strive to explore strategies and ideas to potentially help you capitalize on your financial decisions. We are capitalizers, and this is our show.
Welcome back to Capitalize Your Finances. As always, I'm your host, Chris Ray Panayiotou, the Cap in Capitalize. And today, my very special guest is the author of the Business Transition Handbook. She's become one of my dearest friends. We have bantered about M&A and business and merger and acquisition stuff, all the nerdy stuff that most people don't care about, but we do. The lovely Laurie Barkman. Laurie, welcome to the show.
Chris, thank you so much. What an introduction. I really enjoy our text banter and even the conversation banter. And Thank you so much for having me on your show. It's a great platform and you do such a nice job with it. And I'm really glad to be here.
Well, thank you. And I want to dive right into the book because time is precious. You are a very, very high demand woman. And so right off the bat, in your book, which I loved your book, by the way. And for those of you that are looking to buy or sell or really understand what the heck you need to do with business, you need to go buy this book immediately. If you haven't, I'm very disappointed in you. But you talk about all the potential exit strategies that a business owner or owners have at their fingertips. Now, as I was reading this, I got to be honest, I couldn't help but have the fear because someday in the very, very distant future, I'll have to sell my business. Everyone has to sell their business at some point. So my question to you, it's actually for you specifically. When you left your first CEO position, what were the emotions that went through your body, mind, and spirit?
I call myself the Business Transition Sherpa for a reason. It has to do with movement. And transition is a really good word. You asked me about this moment in time when I left my CEO position. We went through a pretty major transaction. I was one of 16 executives at this privately held third generation company, 125-year-old business. My boss was the chairman and I was running one of the divisions. And we were acquired by a global shipping company. And I was involved in after the transaction, involved in the integration and planning for a new line of business. And immediately the plans for how to integrate. One of the things that's not a surprise is sometimes we make changes when we're acquired, right? We start to strip off pieces of the business or teams that we don't need anymore, like HR, finance, legal, IT. Those are typically the first teams behind the scenes to get cut. And then eventually they'll make other decisions. So in my team, they did make those types of decisions. So my feeling when I left was I was sad. That was my emotion. I was sad. I was excited to work at this company for a long time. But I recognized why it was important for me to move on, and it was the right thing to do. And it's very common. And I was okay with it. But in my immediate reaction, of course, you go through these emotional stages. And I went through them very quickly.
And you actually mentioned in business, you think of these three strategic readiness pillars, the business side, the personal side, and the financial side. Now, as I was going through your exercise, when it came to the financial side, I think it's going to be safe to say I've got that one covered, because if not, we've got a serious problem. And then the business side, it was certainly intriguing to me on the prep, on how these businesses move from the old to the new owners. But the personal readiness pillar is what I wanted to briefly discuss. And you mentioned your sadness, if you will, once you transitioned out of CEO. And it's interesting to me, and I thought about this with one of my past guests, Ken Rusk. a lot of these blue collar business owners do a much better job, in my humble opinion, on mastering the personal pillar than a lot of these white collar service-based business owners. And so would you say that the personal pillar, it's the most difficult to conquer? And if you agree with me on that, why do you think that's the case?
Well, I feel like there's sort of two questions baked into here. So the first thing is a hypothesis that you formed around, is there a difference between blue collar and white collar? Not that I've seen. And I would love to talk with Ken about his experience, and I believe he's coming on my show in a couple of weeks. So I'm excited about that conversation. Beyond that, though, and I think this is really to the nature of your question, it's so common for, regardless of what kind of business it is, that owners have regrets, and they have regrets for a variety of reasons. We can have regrets, and survey data from the Exit Planning Institute shows this, that 1 year after the sale, about 75% of owners express regret. Yeah. There's, again, a lot of issues here that we can unpack. And I think for family businesses, if their name is on the door, the identity is very tied in with that. In the community, the standing with employees, that's a big thing. And many privately held companies have that situation. I think it's, I want to say 2 out of 5 or something like that. And another issue when it comes to the pillar of this is this concept of push factors and pull factors. And I talk about this in the book, and a transition mindset, having a transition mindset. What does that all mean? Well, if we feel that we're being pushed out of our company, if there's something that's pushing us out, like it can be real disaster, like COVID has shut down our business and we can't operate anymore. It could be something like that. Mm-hmm. It could be natural disaster. It could be partner dissolution. It could be a divorce. It could be death. It could be death in your family. It could be a death of a partner's family. It could be a death of a key employee. I have someone who's come on my show and talked about her experience with her aunt dying. Her aunt was a key employee, and when her aunt died suddenly at age 52, it threw the company into a tailspin. She was the anchor behind the scenes. Her father was the front man and the salesperson, and his sister was really running the ship. And when this woman sort of stepped into her aunt's role, she was literally piecing together Post-it notes from her desk of, how do I close the books and how do I pay people? And so those types of things can really be negative factors, and they can have a negative impact on the value of your business. A negative thing that also can help makes us feel pushed out is when we're just not really on board with the process. Maybe it's being pushed on us by someone else. So you have to really believe in it. You have to participate in it. Then you're going to create a proactive approach. You're going to have pull factors. You're going to have things that you're excited about. A pull factor is literally pulling you to your next thing. And it's tied in your identity. It's tied into the roles that you play inside, outside of work. So many business owners have their social network built into the company too. And if you're separating from the company, wow, you're going to be leaving your friendships behind. That feels very scary. When we have a new pair of shoes, we know what they feel like, and they're very comfortable. If we get a new pair of shoes, what do we fear? We fear the blisters. There's some folks that are just wired for building to sell. They want to build their company and move on. They want to build the next one and move on. And then there's many business owners who view their business as a job and not as an asset to be cared for and eventually monetized in some way. So lots and lots of things we could unpack here.
Yeah, well, in that last part on the job versus asset, in a lot of these owners' defense, you don't get to feel what an asset is until you're dug out of the hole. I that's one thing I wish I knew in entrepreneurship when I started on my journey is everyone thinks, oh my gosh, you're an owner and you get to own literally every aspect of it. You get to own the supply chain of your business. You get to own the rights. You get to, there's so much fulfillment. But whether you like it or not, for the first couple of years, and I'd say at least 5, depending on the business, it is a job because you're going to be broker than broke. And one thing I do have to ask and this was not a question I had, but you brought it up. Are you a Post-it note person or not?
I am a note person, and I've tried to become more digital. But yes, I do love myself a checklist. And whether it's a Post-it note or whether it's a little task on my calendar, I get a lot of joy out of deleting it and crossing it off.
There's something so fulfilling about and therapeutic about crossing it out. And the reason why I ask is, my teammate Betty is going to be listening into this and just dying laughing, because in our industry, in every industry, it's all about technological advancing and throwing tech against the wall. I should be sponsored by 3M. I mean, the amount of Post-it notes that I have on my desk, Betty has on her desks. I mean, it's hilarious. It's 2023 and we are pro Post-it notes. So I'm just glad that we're not the only ones out there. Now, this is going to be more of a surface level question. So for you, this is a layup, okay? Because we're just getting started. And you mentioned all of the pull factors in why entrepreneurs decide to leave and sell their business. So my question is, out of all the reasons why entrepreneurs decide to leave, what is the most common from your experience?
Why they decide to leave?
Yeah.
Boredom is one of them. Retirement is another. And just wanting to do something different. I think COVID data showed us that owners generally wanted to sell within 7 to 10 years. And because of the COVID pandemic, and owners who have mature companies have not only been through that, they've survived the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, the Twin Towers, and the tragedy with 9/11. They've been through this a number of times, and they're tired. So baby boomers who, folks who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s are definitely in that life stage where they are ready. People who are in their life stage of building, they're builders, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, it's a little more unusual for those folks to say, I'm ready to sell. Those are the builders. Those are what we would call our mountain climbers, that they're ready to challenge themselves, build it so that someone else can take it to the next level, and they're going to move on to the next challenge. So that's more common. The mountain climber mentality can be more common if we're talking age ranges, 30s and 40s. And it's the folks in the 50s who are in this middle zone where they're earning an income, they have their relationships, it's very stable, they don't want to rock the boat. Yeah. And so a common reason for this group to move on, unfortunately, is death and illness.
Well, hopefully, as a 32-year-old, I do not have the death or illness anytime soon. That is one thing I absolutely hope. And I can tell you, 30s and 40s, if you are bored, you are not doing it right. Now, you talk about the pressing issue that most businesses owners are terrified to face, which is, in direct quote from your book, if the owner stepped away, took an extended leave or vacation, etc., would the business suffer or continue onward? End quote. And you further explain the continuation planning and how the less an owner is responsible for overall new business revenue or current, the more attractive the business would be to a seller. So from your experience, would you say the odds of a successful sale come more so from an outside buyer or selling the company to an employee internally in transitioning over a period of time? And does one normally result in a larger multiple than the other?
The most common way to think about who should buy your company is thinking about it in 3 buckets: strategic buyers, financial buyers, and related buyers. Your question about management team, people who are insiders, they know where the bodies are buried, they know the warts, they know the good things. They are part of that related group. So related as family or related as management. Selling to management is a very common transaction. It's an internal transaction, internal transition. There's good reasons for that because they do know the business. Their hearts are in it. They've helped build it. They feel very tied to it. I have a client right now. That's what we're working on with her, is trying to figure out how that she can, over time, sell a minority stake to her key managers because she's not ready to give up control. But over time she will. So how do we stage that over? How do we do that? It's very, very common, especially in the lower middle market, where businesses that are under 10 million of revenue, under 5 million of revenue, they feel like it's their role to have their legacy stay forward with their teams. There's a loyalty for that. There's a monetary reason for that. And I think if we go back to the earlier conversation about the pillar around personal goals and not feeling like we are going to regret our exit, another reason why people do have regrets is because their people may not have benefited the way that we would have liked to see them benefit. So if we sell our company to our management team, wow, don't we have a direct impact on that, right?
Yeah.
Now, it is common to, the other part of your question, I just want to make sure I'm answering it. You were saying the most common, and I do think management team is the most common. What was the other part of your question?
So my part was, does it normally result in a larger multiple internally versus externally?
It's actually the lowest of the three buckets. And I kind of put them left to right for a reason. Typically, the highest is going to be your third-party strategic buyer. This is a company or an entity that's looking to stitch your assets into theirs and get synergies out of cost containment, like I mentioned earlier in my story. And that was what happened with our company and how the assets were shifted around a bit. And the middle section of the two was the financial buyers, which are your private equity groups. There are examples where, and certainly in any of these, where what I'm saying could be completely wrong, but I'm just saying in general, right? In general, that's kind of how they stack up.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, it's okay to be wrong on this show. We're not going to be right every time, but one thing I tell everyone is I've been more right than wrong, which is why I'm still here. So just take that to the bank. Now, you actually mentioned one of your stats earlier, and I just want to reiterate, because there were a couple stats in your book that really shocked me. And one of them was, according to the EPI, the Exit Planning Institute, less than 10% of business owners have a formal written life after business plan. Half of the owners have no plans in place to cover illness or death or forced accident. And then 75% of those who exit profoundly regret the decision within 12 months of exiting. So again, we covered a lot of that earlier. But when you left as the CEO of your $100 million company, okay, that you served, what was it like for your 12 months after that?
Well, I joined a private equity group. And was starting to really have some fun with it, because being on the other side of the deal table was different for me, and I liked it. And we were searching for deals, and then we had some businesses that were already in the portfolio, and I was working closely with them. So it was bringing in some skills for me that I hadn't really, using those muscles I hadn't used in a while, because some of these companies were young or early stage. And I was able to flex some of my early stage startup muscles and marketing muscles and thinking about what should we be working on strategy wise. When you're running a larger company, you get further and further away from the whiteboard, right? And so it was pretty cool to do that, and also getting some deal experience was cool. So for me, and that was really the start of my M&A journey, was being part of this team that sold the company to this global logistics firm, and then eventually going on the investor side. So that was the 12 months after I left.
And going off of that, as I was listening to you, I couldn't help but think. So let's take it back to something very elementary. Okay, so you have two younger kiddos, right? And I mean, they're not like 5.5 months old like my daughter, but they're younger. And
they're
let's
22
say that,
and 19 for all intents and purposes.
Okay, so let's say that they're dating. They dated someone for a while, doesn't work out. And, there is such thing as the rebound person. We've all been there. It's not great, but such is life. My question is, and I was just thinking about this because you jumped right into this next line of work, but you loved it. And so it was something that was very good for you. would you recommend that a lot of these owners that do sell attempt the same maneuver that you did? Or would you say, hey, don't do what I did because it was very unique, because you may have that rebound type of feeling and therefore you may have some guilt? Do you see where I'm coming from there?
Yeah. Isn't it good to do some planning around that? Because then we're really clear on our intentions. Yeah. There are people who have said to me, their intentions are they just want to be in the grandparent business. They don't want to go into another company. They really are intending to retire. Maybe they'll consult a little bit. Other people are not looking to be the boss anymore. Heavy is the head that wears the crown, right? Mm-hmm. And if we even think back to Tim Ferriss's story, even though he got his business down to 4-hour work week, or 4 hours in a work week, he still sold the company. He sold the supplements company. Because why? Because it was always on his mind. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. So I think that there's a number of things that can drive us to want to have a different role. Even take Sean Oshman. He was running a IT services company in Colorado. His story is that, and he was on Built to Sell Radio, which is a great podcast with John Warlow. Mm-hmm. And he talked about at age 39 deciding to sell his little IT services company. He sold it for a modest multiple. But why? Because he wanted to sail around the world. That's what he wanted to do. And he sold it for 2 to 3 times SDE, which we can talk about what that means, but essentially net operating income. Yes. With some add backs. And that's a great story. And that was Sean's, at age 40, that's what he wanted to do. There's a gentleman who was on my show, Dan is his first name, and I didn't know this about him in the interview. I wish I did. We would have talked more about it. He and I met up for coffee the other week because we hadn't seen each other through COVID, and it was like just a chance to just reconnect and talk about my book and everything. And we talked about him selling his company. And you know what he did? He had 5 kids at the time, and all the kids were in the age ranges of middle school to early high school. So let's say, 3rd grade and 9th grade. He had 5 kids. And you know what he did? They sold the company, and this was his dream, he wanted to go to Australia and New Zealand, homeschool the kids, quote unquote, in an RV. And that's what they did. That's what they did. How did I miss that part of his story? I had to get him back on the air. That was crazy.
That is next level. I can tell you, for those listening in, that would not be my point of attack. I do think it's pretty awesome, though, how, and even being a new parent, perspective changes so rapidly. And in many ways, the drive grows, but in other ways, I wouldn't say it diminishes, but it just changes. It's interesting. So speaking of transitioning out, so I'm not going to ask you this question, but I have to tell you, one of my least favorite questions people ask me, and this is just more in general at casual gatherings, is what would you do today if you weren't doing what you're doing right now? And I can honestly say that thought terrifies me, because I genuinely feel like I've been put on this earth to do exactly what I'm doing. And I love every aspect of it. Now, obviously I'm a bit younger and I have a long runway. But for someone in the same mindset, what would you do as an M&A broker, as a sherpa, if you will, to handle their emotional, mental state if you knew that financially it is the perfect time, it makes perfect sense to sell?
I work with clients before they are ready to sell for this reason. If they are not on the market yet, I'll work with them to create a strategic transition plan. And the beginning part of our get to know each other and client onboarding are a couple of different assessments. One of which is a business assessment. We take a look at the business readiness. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses, opportunities, whatever you want to call it, of the business, and what are things that we can be addressing to help build value if we have more time on our side to affect change. The other pillar is the personal readiness, and I have an assessment for that. And both of those assessments are on my website, by the way, if people are interested in taking them. They don't take long, but the value you get out of them and the conversations we'll have is really the quite valuable to get started on this thinking. The third one, which I think you'll really appreciate, and you and I should partner on if we have an opportunity to do so, is on the financial planning. And so I have a tool for that. And of course, you have tools that are wonderful. And the main point here with the client is, how do they understand what their business is worth today? What do they need it to be worth to satisfy their lifestyle requirements in the future, given all their other assets too, right? And given also how long, hopefully, they have to live on this planet. So if we go back to the business for a second, and I do business valuations, and part of my work is to work with them on that and understand, what is the business worth today? Well, if it's a lot lower than they need or a lot lower than they expected, isn't that interesting to know now so that we can do something about it? The client that's come to me and says, I'm ready to sell, may not be sell ready. The company may not be as transferable or attractive as they think it is, and therefore may have less value in the market. But you know, Chris, who determines value? The buyer.
Yes.
What do we know? We don't know until the buyers buy, right? So in an M&A process, I'm going to try to bring multiple buyers to the table so that we can have some competition. But in a private market, we can't just go to Yahoo Finance and look up the price of the stock and the market cap of the business. So there's an infinite way we can value a company, and it's the art and the science and the math behind it. And ultimately, what will get your company to sell above your peers, just like your house on your street? Why is your house worth more if it's the exact same box in the exact same lot? It's because of the stuff you've done in the inside. Well, same with your company. What makes it special? What's that Rembrandt in the attic? What is that special X that you have? And how do we capitalize on that? Can I use your word? How do we capitalize on that?
Yeah.
And I love to also just beat this horse a little bit. When we have more time, we can create more valuable exit options.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. And your tools on your website are phenomenal. I had a blast just tinkering around with them for my own business, and then for a couple clients that are actually looking to sell their business. And it was fascinating. And the reason why I was so keen on asking that question, so when I first started in this business, I was all about the academic side, right? Because as a young, dumb kid, who the hell is going to trust you with X, Y, Z? So I was all about this quantitative research and just stuffing it down people's throat. Well, the game's changed a little bit because now it's at that point where I tell people you're always trying to kick a field goal. So if you sway one side too far to, whatever goalpost, it's the art. The other too far of the side is the science. And the art is the emotion. And it's just been fascinating to me how it does not matter how much numerical jargon you throw at these people. They just emotionally are not ready. And it's one of those things where I'm coming to grips with, one of my favorite quotes is, I can't want it more than you. I cannot want this more than you. And do you ever have those moments where you're talking to these people, you've gone through the numbers, you've talked to these planners, you've talked to these CPAs, and for whatever reason, that goalpost of the art, they're just swaying too hard to it. I mean, what do you do at that point? Do you just walk away? Or do you have any tips in your head? Do you play big bad mama bear and say, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed? What is the secret sauce?
Well, there is definitely mergers and acquisitions advisors whose playbook is, we align up front on what your business is worth, and if we are really not aligned, we shouldn't take you on as a client, because we don't want to disappoint you and we don't want to waste our time.
Yeah.
There are definitely people who think that, and I can understand that with good reason. I think for me, it's probably maybe that the company is too small, right? And so it's not that we're disagreeing on the value, it's just that I have to have a return on time also. Mm-hmm. What I see more often is a alignment on a range. We understand that there's a range of value. When we hear about other deals that are done and the multiples that this company got or that got. We don't know if it's true or not, because if I don't see it in my database, I can't prove it. So that's a challenge when there's an information gap, because we don't really know what this, how is the buyer going to see us? I have a situation where with a client, we valued the business at, and I'll just make this up, at 5 million value, and they want to sell for 10. That becomes my challenge, which I have accepted in this gauntlet. How do we position? It's a strategic sale. How do we position this company so that the buyer really is willing to pay a premium? We know what it could sell for, right? Yes. They don't know what we know. I don't know what bidding they have. They haven't submitted a bid yet, but why couldn't we aim for 10? There's no reason why we can't aim for 10. It doesn't mean we're going to get it, but we need to position ourselves to aim for 10. Yeah. And so as an M&A advisor, in this particular situation, I have accepted the challenge that we're going to go for it and see what happens. But many times, if we are just convinced this is, really the price, and we just completely disagree on strategy with the seller, then it's probably not a good fit.
Sure. Well, I wanted you to take a moment, actually. So speaking of the types of sale, so can you enlighten our capitalizers on the surface level, because I know you could nerd out till the cows come home, differences between a seller note, earnout, and recapitalization?
Sure. Yeah, and this is important when we still in the very early phases of trying to understand what your goals are and what roles you might want to play in terms of your transition. These are some of the things on the list. A seller note puts you in a position of being a lender. Just think of it quite simply like that. That if you sell your business, some or all of the financing is coming from you. Meaning that you create a promissory note, you agree on the terms just like you would with a bank, but you are essentially you're the lender. And the buyer is going to pay you back monthly basis, however you agree on those terms with an interest rate. So that's a seller note. It's interesting to note here too, if the buyer is buying your business with an SBA loan or a commercial loan from a bank, they may like to see a seller note because they like to see that the seller is still involved. Now, sellers, on the other hand, many of them do not want to do seller notes. Now, some do. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying in general. And the sellers that I've worked with have not been interested in that. But there are definitely pros and cons to it. So a seller note is essentially a lender. Now, the next one you wanted me to talk about?
And the next one is earnout.
An earnout is when a buyer and seller have agreed on terms for the purchase price, but then there's additional consideration. Maybe we are not aligned. Maybe I really want to sell my business for $1 million, and you're saying, nope, it's not worth that. It's worth $500,000. So what happens with an earnout is that we oftentimes see that these are the technique used to bridge the gap and then some. There's an element of risk to it because an earnout is not guaranteed. And let's say that in this situation of the $500K. So the purchase price is $500, and then we have an earnout opportunity for another $500. So that gets me, in theory, to the $1 million that I'm looking for in my total transaction value. But in an earnout, we're setting targets. My advisement is to try to get as high up on that P&L statement as possible, meaning set a target for revenue if that's something you can influence versus setting a target on EBITDA, which is so many factors in between those things that you may not influence. And so typically in an earnout, you want to have measurements that you can impact. Sometimes people tie an earnout to just time. Let's say your tenure every year or so on. So there's different ways to structure an earnout. It's agreed upon with milestones and time frame. So there's no one way to do it, but in general, that's an earnout.
And then the last one, recapitalization.
Okay. A recapitalization. So let's say you own 100% of your business. And I actually just closed a deal for my client. He and his wife own the business together, and he brought on a investor. Now, in this case, this is a majority recapitalization. So what does that mean? Well, instead of my client owning more than half of the shares, this buyer has acquired 60% of the company. And so with the transaction, he became a minority shareholder. So it's a recapitalization of your shares. And whether or not you want to maintain majority control or minority is obviously up to you. And that's up, neither here nor there. There's no pros and cons. It's just strategy. And that was how they structured it. So a recapitalization is a agreement upon what you still have to agree upon the value of the business, and then it's essentially a prorated amount that's being acquired.
Now that we know the three, would you say that there are some more common in industries than others? Do you have any examples?
It really depends, because I think you'll see examples of everything everywhere. I can't really comment by industry, because these are all tactics that you'll see literally used. It just depends on the transaction.
Capitalizers, this episode is sponsored by the best-selling book, Capitalize Your Finances, the how-to framework that takes you from compoundingly clueless to monetarily magnificent. Regardless of where you're at in your financial life, whether you're just beginning to express interest and commitment to your personal finances, at the pinnacle of your career, winding down into retirement, or thinking about your legacy for future generations, this book walks you through every step of the way so you can succeed on your terms and with your own values and passions guiding you. After reading this book, you will officially have Christopher A. Panayotu, the Cap in Capitalize, in your back pocket, guiding you in detail through every step of the way so that you can take charge of your finances, not the other way around. Head on over to Amazon.com today and start capitalizing your finances to the fullest with this incredible book, Capitalize Your Finances, the how-to financial framework that takes you from compoundingly clueless to monetarily magnificent. And now, back to the episode.
Sure. And that's totally fine. That's totally fair. Well, and as I was reading your chapter on improving cash flow, a curious thought piqued my interest. Now, in investing in M&A, there are so many calculations when valuing a business. Now, I have my thoughts. However, this is not about me, it's about you. And so, in your opinion, what are some of the calculations that you would say are most overblown and overrated in valuing a business?
Okay, so this goes back to my comment of the art and the science of how to value a business. There's three techniques for how to value a business, and the most common one we use in the lower middle market is a market-based valuation technique, where we are looking at existing comps. Just like in a home market, you're looking for comps in your area, homes of generally your size. So we look at the industry, either the NICS code or the SIC code. We look at the deal size of the prior deal to be commensurate roughly with where we are. And also we look at the time frame, that we don't want to look at data really more than 5-6 years old, because it starts to become a little less relevant. So that's sort of the first part. Now, the next part is really important for business owners in the getting organized category of life here. Most business owners are putting expenses through the business that are either personal or one-time. They might be related to you as an owner, but they're related to you as an owner for work. That's different than related to you for personal reasons. And again, I'm not judging, I'm just saying this is a reality. And it happens, and there's reasons for that, and people trying to tax mitigation strategies and so on. But let's talk about a client of mine, construction company, they build homes. And they had landscaping services, and they had snow removal for his personal home. They built a barn. all those expenses are run through the company and they were not tracked separately. So when I was looking to do evaluation for the business and I said, did you have any personal expenses or anything that the company, was a one-time expense? It was really hard for him to give me some numbers. Now, of course, we estimate and so on. So what is the message here? The message is, if you're going to do it, just have your own credit card for it, or just make sure it's put into a certain account in your QuickBooks, so that when the time comes and we're going to do evaluation, you're not going to lose out. Let's take the toilet paper example. If you are running the purchase of toilet paper through your business and you spend $1, congratulations, you've saved 30 cents in taxes, right? Or 25 cents, whatever it is.
Yes.
And if we value your business at 3 times EBITDA, you have now foregone $3. You've saved 30 cents and you've foregone $3. So that's the math. And that's the incentive and why in a valuation conversation, it's so important. So add backs are critical. Add backs are things that a buyer might make different decisions about. They could be big things like IT services, or they could be on the expense line. They could be owner related. If the owner's not going to be in the business anymore and you have health care and car payments and rent for an office that's going to the owner, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of those costs may not be continued by the new owner. So we show them as add backs, which is a net bottom line impact to EBITDA, which is usually a good thing, a good positive. On the flip side, we have to also be honest with revenues. If we have a big one-time revenue from a client that is very, very unlikely to be replicated, we take that out because that's not revenue that should be expected in the future. So we have to be balanced in how we do add backs. But things like non-cash, depreciation, amortization, anything from the government related to PPP, those would all not be included in valuations. And so what does that leave us with? It leaves us with the intangibles, with goodwill, what's the brand, and what are the other assets of the business. So in the book, you may recall, there was a topic of, let's make a list. What are the true assets of your business? And I'm not just talking about FFE, fixtures, furniture, and equipment. I'm talking about your customer database, your IP, things that are inherently unique and different in your company. And how do we capitalize on those? How do we bake that into the model? And it all boils down to 8 core drivers, which I'm happy to share what those are. But that's essentially, to your question, why I say it's an art and a science, because there's the math side of how we do these calculations. And then there's the, what are some reasons that our valuation would be up or down?
Yeah. Well, and you also mentioned regarding growth of business. There's a huge difference between organic and inorganic growth in business development. And I was thinking about this in the context of dealing with first generation as opposed to second or third, fourth, et cetera, generation owners. And, the first generation, from my experience, all about organic growth, networking, building the business off of trust, building off of referrals from business partners, et cetera. I'm not saying the second generation doesn't agree, but for whatever reason, they are super trigger friendly on the M&A side of things. And they almost rely on it. So I kind of have multiple questions regarding this subject. So from a buyer's perspective, what business do you think has more intrinsic value? An organically grown or one that has been built upon M&A? Let's start there.
Well, let's answer it by looking at the value drivers. What's going to drive value in an enterprise? I don't really know if we look at it as how they got there, and more so about, well, where are they now? And how transferable and how attractive is it to a buyer will drive that answer. First off is going to be the financials. It's the size of the business, and for whatever reason, the 10-year mark is a maturity mark. I see it over and over again. And also 10 million is another kind of inflection point. 10 million, 25 million tends to be an inflection point on valuations. And why is that? Because a more mature business, a business that is larger, is assumed inherently to not be very dependent on the owner. A business that cannot thrive without its owner is not going to be a business that's worth very much. If you can't take a vacation, if you can't step away, and if your people can't solve problems, the business will not be worth as much as if you can really be a hands-off owner, arm's length. Yeah. It's kind of counterintuitive because so many owners think they are the secret sauce, and their mind gets blown when they take the survey that I have, and then they realize, oh my gosh, I'm the bottleneck. I had a woman, she runs a design and photography business, and she literally said to me, oh my goodness, I'm holding my company back. It's that realization that while you as the founder, your sweat equity, what you're doing to build the business, the charisma that you have to get customers is awesome, right? And when you said the second generation, usually the second generation is told, here are the keys, don't screw it up.
Yeah.
Spouting whale gets harpooned, don't mess it up. So they don't. And they tend to just flatline.
Well, and that was another question. That was the second part. So what do you think is the cause and difference between the first and second generation and in their tendencies?
Well, maybe generationally it's starting to shift, but the stories that I have, for people that have come on my podcast, which is called Succession Stories, what I hear most often about that is the first generation is quote unquote old school, right? They have at this point, many of them passed on, and so the stories are coming from the second or third generation to me. Yeah. And they talk about them as really having the entrepreneurial spirit, right? They took the risk. They had no money. They were immigrants. They built this from scratch, and there's such pride, right? Such amazing pride. And when we know the birthdays of our customers and their wives and the dogs' names and the kids, it feels amazing. But what happens when Gen 1 passes on? Many of those relationships don't continue forward. That's the risk, right? That's the risk about having such an owner-dependent situation with a company, or if the owner is really the sales generation leader, we call that the rainmaker. There's a risk there. It's goodness, and it's good, and it's helped us get to a certain point, but it's also risk. So when the second generation gets the keys, they often are in a situation where the leadership from their parents was so domineering in their upbringing in the company. They needed that person to help with conflict resolution, strategic decisions. They themselves were not necessarily empowered to do so. That happens sometimes, not in all situations with family businesses, but there's no outside influence to help break the tie, right? And when you can't separate from it either. When Thanksgiving dinners, if there's a problem, they're talking about it at Thanksgiving. It's just omnipresent in family businesses. And my little quip about, spouting whale gets harpooned is from one of the guests on my show who has worked with literally thousands of family businesses. And that's what she said, is that basically the second generation is told, here are the keys, don't mess it up. And so what happens is the second gen just wants to continue on what the first gen did. They don't want to change anything, and then they don't invest. And so a lot of times the business starts to go downhill, which is one of the reasons why the third generation doesn't continue as a high of a rate as the second gen. It goes down to about 8%. So net, 70% of family businesses don't continue past the third generation. And which is sad, right? Because we all know how family businesses fuel our economy. And these are many of these companies are the ones that are looking for transition and exit at some point.
Well, and obviously succession planning, it's mission critical if that is the intended route, as opposed to, a forced exit or third party, you name it. And that portion of your book made me think about our lovely little angel, Abigail, and maybe someday transitioning the business to her. Again, it's just an option. And I'm going to safely assume that having this discussion now at nearly 6 months old is probably a tad premature. However, my question to you is, for family-owned businesses, what would you say is an appropriate age to have that conversation?
Isn't it amazing to think about having that conversation? What a privilege it is, right? With this existing entity and we're being invited into it. I think first and foremost, let's just recognize that. But also the act of having the conversation is the main thing, because we don't want to assume. And we can assume on both sides of this in a lot of ways. I think it's the right thing to start early, probably high school, but the caveat is no pressure. The other caveat is go explore. Many people have talked to me about their family, if it's a larger enterprise, there's a lot of family businesses that become enterprises, right? They become owner investors as opposed to owner operators. And these folks have said, yeah, you know what? There's a rite of passage at age 16. There's one of the episodes on my show, it's a wonderful story. I think it's episode 3, actually. And they talked about their family business, and they have a wonderful tradition. At age 16, these folks, cousins, and everybody, big family at this point. And they're invited to the family meeting, and they're given a coin. And it's a tradition, right, in this coin. And the reason why they give the coin is because if they ever find themselves in a stalemate, they will use the coin flip, to make the decision. And what they said is, we hope to never be in that place. And that's why they have a family board, they have a family council. Now, they're large enough to sustain all these types of organizations, but some of the episodes of my show where they've talked about that, it's really healthy. One, on the bringing people in, the legacy of what it means and the importance, and it's an invitation. They don't have to accept it, but if they choose to, here are the guidelines, right? The other thing I hear quite often is that young people, if they're entering their family business, they're encouraged, at many companies, not all, but many, to go get experience somewhere else first. And then when they join, be ready to add value. There's one gentleman on my show, he and his brother are co-CEO of a 4th generation company. And he said when he came into his company, this family business, he knew he had a target on his back. It's how he felt. And he needed to prove his value every day. And so the other encouragement is you have to want it, right? So having a conversation with this young person, do they want it? The answer might be no. And isn't that important to find out? If the answer is yes, then set up the mentoring, set up a plan. When do they join? What experience do they need? And just be open and honest about it. And if they say no, they don't want in, respect that. The other thing on the other side of this coin is, you know what? They may not have the talent. They may have the interest, but they don't have the talent. Real young people need a chance to learn and grow. But if over time someone thinks they are the incumbent to the CEO and the reality is, oh my goodness, no, they're not. Let's do everybody a favor and just be honest about that and how we're going to look from the outside and other options. I think it's just really important to be having that open and honest conversation so that you can create a path.
Yeah. And by the way, for those that are watching on YouTube and not listening on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, I was not laughing at anything other than I could not help but imagine Succession on HBO. And you quoted that a couple times in your book, where that is a prime example of not one, not two, but 3 people that should not be running this company that are fighting tooth and nail. And I won't give anything away for those that haven't watched.
No spoilers.
For those of you that are younger listening, you probably should wait a little bit to watch that show. So, but it's neither here nor there. You laid out this amazing process of selling a business in tremendous depth. But for our listeners that have not read your book yet, how long does it take to sell a business, and what are the steps to take when selling your business? If you could spark note it for us.
My favorite answer is it depends.
Yes.
Now, why does it depend? Because it depends on our starting point. So remember the conversation we had earlier about, are we ready to sell or are we sell ready? We might think that everything's great and we can just list it and off we go. And we're going to get an M&A broker like Laurie Barkman to help us out. Okay, that's great. Let's sign an engagement agreement. Let's make a decision that you're ready. What's the first thing that we do? We have to organize your financials. The more prepared you are The more organized you are, will make this, let's say, 2 months of work, it's probably sometimes 3, in preparation and onboarding for us to learn your business and organize the financials and organize what's called a SIM, a confidential information memorandum. It's essentially the marketing document for your company. It can be a Word document, it can be a PowerPoint, but nonetheless, it's got financials, it's got your competitive positioning, it's got tons of information. If it's a Word doc, it's typically 30 pages. So it's no small thing to put that together. And why is this the first step? Well, the first step is this because we have to know what our product is. What are we selling? Then the next phase of work is who might be the buyer, who might be buying. A firm like Stony Hill Advisors has a lot of resources to build lists of buyers that are already in our database, or we have access to databases where we can do research and by industry, et cetera, et cetera. So building the buyer outreach is really the next part. Then for companies that are large enough where it makes sense to run a bid process, I've organized that for my clients where I'll say, okay, here's the terms. If you're interested, here, sign this NDA. You can get access to the SIM and the pre-LOI data room, and I'll explain LOI in a second. The pre-LOI data room where you can get information and decide whether or not you want to put in an offer. If you want to put in an offer, the buyer's going to submit a letter of intent. And we would have specified what are things that we want to see in the letter of intent. Then once we've received the LOIs, we hopefully can make some choices about which dance partner we want to have to the next party. And that moves us into the due diligence phase. How long does due diligence take? Of course, that varies a lot, right? How complex is this deal? And do we have environmental issues, right? So by industry, this can vary quite a bit versus this is an e-commerce company and, it might be some things to understand there, or it's a, very IP heavy and we have to hire IP attorneys to really understand what are we buying. So the level of analysis typically is on people, tools, and equipment, let's say, or the physical things, the intangible things. It can be brand related, customer database, as well as the real true assets of this business, what is transferring. And that will also influence the type of structure we have for the deals at an asset sale or an equity sale. So that's really important. And we'll know that up front too. But, and so you're negotiating terms with the buyers and we move into the purchase agreement phase and closing. That can take, how long does that all take? Wow, if we are moving and shaking, that can take 6 months. If it's pretty typical, it could take a year. It could stretch longer for any number of reasons on diligence. Financing is a big reason why we see delays on the buyer side, that they have not lined up financing like they need to, or they've said they would. There's any number of pitfalls of why something could go longer. Typically, it's diligence. And to all my attorney friends listening out there, we appreciate the M&A side. Yes. When we work with attorneys who have M&A experience, because they understand that there can be deal fatigue if things drag on too long and too many red lines and back and forth and back and forth. So my encouragement to everybody is to be reasonable, be fair, and press for what you need, but also be mindful about the other side. Eventually, could be just tired. Also, I'll just give a plug for, some people retrade. Some find it very distasteful. Some retrade for good reason. I think that's fine, but retrading an offer not for good reason or dragging it out and then retrading is not ethical, and I don't advocate for that either.
Well, and I can tell you, not only do you appreciate people having their paperwork already in good to go, I think universally everyone appreciates that. That there is really nothing more defeating than if someone calls in and they call up Betty as an example and say, hey, want to meet with Chris? That's great. She sends all this paperwork. And then we sit down and you ask, hey, do you have the paperwork? Now, sometimes if they just forget at home, okay, whatever. It is what it is. But when they say, yeah, I got it, and I didn't do anything with it, there is nothing more defeating in that process. Because that's like, what is your name? So for those of you listening, get the paperwork done. Now, unfortunately, our episode is coming to a close. And Laurie, I have had oodles of fun with you. And I wanted to close with this parting question. What is the best piece of advice you can give business owners looking to sell their business?
The best piece of advice I can give business owners looking to sell is to start today. If you haven't already started thinking about it, the best time was yesterday. The second best time is today.
Yes. And where can our lovely, exquisite, brilliant, humble capitalizers go to support you?
They can go to my website, which is the businesstransitionSherpa.com. They can stalk me on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to have them connect with me there. And I don't say stalk it, literally, but no, they can find me on LinkedIn and connect with me there. And please let me know if you're listening to this episode and that's how you found me. That would be great. I'm also on all the other platforms, but I'm on LinkedIn probably the most. And the resources that I mentioned earlier, they can find on my website, and my book and the podcast are also on my website. If they want to pick up their own copy of the Business Transition Handbook, they can grab it on Amazon, and Succession Stories is available wherever you listen.
Awesome. Laurie, thank you so much. And for those of you that are continuing to tune in to the very end, as always, thank you for listening to Capitalize Your Finances. For you veterans out there, welcome back. You've been gladly missed. For those of you that are newbies, welcome to the show. If you have any questions about today's episode's guest or questions in general, you can either give us a call at 253-214-3050. That's 253-214-3050. Or you can shoot me an email, chris@capitalizeyourfinances.com. If you have a little tickle that you want to be possibly a guest on the show, head on over to capitalizepodcast.com. Hit us up with an inquiry. We look at them every single day. As always, I'm your host, Chris Paniotu, the Cap and Capitalize. And until next time, keep capitalizing.
Christopher Paniotu is a registered representative with and securities and advisory services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor and member FINRA SIPC. The investment professionals are affiliated with LPL Financial and are conducting business using the name Capitalize Your Finances, a separate entity from LPL Financial. Laurie Barkman and any other individual or company mentioned in this podcast are not affiliated with Capitalize Your Finances or LPL Financial.